The first sign something was wrong wasn't the trail, it wasn't the benches, and it wasn't even the giant wooden sign bolted into one of my trees. It was the look on a homeowner's face when he saw me standing on my own property. He slowed down on the trail, gave me that polite suburban smile, then asked, "You lost, buddy?" I remember staring at him for a second because I honestly thought he was joking. I was standing nearly a mile inside land that had belonged to my family for generations, land I had inherited only a few months earlier after my grandfather, Walter Grayson, passed away. But the guy wasn't joking. As far as he knew, I was the stranger. That's when I realized this situation was much bigger than a few people taking a walk through the woods. My grandfather had always been a quiet man. He wasn't wealthy by millionaire standards, and nobody expected his estate to contain anything extraordinary. When the attorney gathered us together after the funeral, everyone assumed the assets would consist of his small farmhouse, a couple savings accounts, and some family heirlooms. Then the attorney unfolded a survey map across the conference table. The room got very quiet. Attached to the house was a 300-acre tract of heavily wooded land stretching behind one of the fastest-growing subdivisions in the county. Most of my relatives didn't even know it still belonged to the family. I certainly didn't. The property had been acquired by my great-grandfather decades before developers ever discovered the area. Back then it was farmland and timberland. Over the years roads appeared, shopping centers arrived, and eventually a massive subdivision called Oak Hollow Estates was built right beside it. Houses multiplied. Property values climbed. The town expanded. Somehow the forest remained untouched. After inheriting everything, I decided to visit the land personally. At first it felt exactly how I remembered it from childhood visits with my grandfather: peaceful woods, tall pines, winding creeks, wildlife everywhere. Then I started noticing strange things. There were professionally maintained walking trails cutting through the property. Decorative benches had been installed at scenic locations. Small bridges crossed drainage areas. Somebody had spent serious money building infrastructure inside land they did not own. The deeper I walked, the stranger it became. Then I found the sign. It stood near a main trail intersection and displayed a detailed map. Across the top, in large engraved letters, were the words Oak Hollow Community Nature Preserve. I literally laughed out loud because the alternative was getting angry. Community preserve? According to who? There was no preserve. There was no community ownership. There was only my family's land. Yet the sign looked official enough to convince anyone. A few minutes later, I found more evidence. Directional markers, wildlife education boards, HOA logos attached to trail posts. Somebody had essentially rebranded private property as a neighborhood amenity. Driving home that afternoon, I kept wondering how this had happened. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe residents genuinely believed the developer owned the forest. Maybe the HOA board simply never checked property records. So I chose the most reasonable approach possible. I ordered updated title documents. I hired a survey company. I gathered every legal record connected to the property. The results were crystal clear. The boundaries matched the original deed. The acreage belonged entirely to me. There were no public access easements, no recreational agreements, no HOA rights, nothing. Armed with that information, I sent a polite letter to the HOA board. Not a threat, not an accusation, just a professional notice explaining that the land was privately owned and requesting removal of the signs and structures. I expected some embarrassment, maybe an apology, maybe a conversation about future access. What I got instead was something completely different. A week later, I received a response from the HOA president. The tone wasn't apologetic. It wasn't cooperative. It was defensive. According to the board, residents had used and maintained the property for years. They argued that the trails benefited the community. They suggested the forest had essentially become common space through long-term use. I read the letter twice because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. They weren't denying I owned the land. They simply seemed offended that ownership mattered. And that was the moment I knew this wasn't going to end with a friendly conversation. Because when people spend years treating something as theirs, even when it legally isn't, they develop a sense of entitlement that's incredibly difficult to reverse. I didn't know it yet, but the fight over those 300 acres was about to become the most absurd HOA battle I had ever experienced. Now let me pause the story for a second because this is where a lot of people misunderstand how property rights actually work. According to standard procedure, ownership isn't determined by who uses land the most, who builds the nicest trail, or who feels emotionally attached to it. Ownership is determined by recorded deeds, surveys, and legally recognized rights. From a legal perspective, what the HOA was doing created a dangerous assumption. They had spent years acting as if access automatically translated into authority. It doesn't. In fact, this is a psychological trap that shows up all the time in HOA disputes. When people repeatedly enjoy a benefit without resistance, they slowly stop viewing it as a privilege and start viewing it as an entitlement. That's when conflicts get ugly. The board wasn't really arguing about maps or property lines anymore. They were defending a story they had told themselves for years. And once people become emotionally invested in a story, facts alone rarely change their minds. Unfortunately for them. Facts were exactly what I was about to bring into the fight. The next month turned into a crash course in how far some people will go when reality threatens their assumptions. After receiving the HOA's response, I hired a survey company to physically mark every corner of the property. A week later, bright orange stakes appeared all around the perimeter. Survey ribbons hung from trees. Boundary markers were refreshed. The results matched every legal document perfectly. There was no ambiguity, no overlap, no forgotten easement hidden in some dusty county archive. The land belonged to me. I figured that would settle the matter. Instead, it somehow made things worse. Within days, photos of the survey markers started appearing on the neighborhood Facebook page. Residents were furious. Some accused me of trying to steal their preserve. Others claimed my grandfather had promised the land to the community years ago, even though nobody could produce a single document supporting that claim. One homeowner posted that the forest had always belonged to Oak Hollow in spirit. I remember reading that line and laughing so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. In spirit. Apparently, we had entered a legal system where emotions counted as property records. Then the complaints became more aggressive. Several residents removed survey ribbons. Others moved boundary stakes. One morning I discovered that somebody had spray painted over a property marker. Another homeowner confronted me near the trail entrance and pointed toward the woods. People have been walking there for 20 years, he snapped. You can't just take it away. I looked at him and said, how can I take away something that was never yours? He didn't have an answer for that. He just walked away angry. That's when I realized the conflict wasn't about ownership anymore. Ownership had already been established. The real battle was over expectations. The HOA had spent years presenting the forest as part of the neighborhood experience. Real estate agents had casually referenced it during home tours. Families had taken pictures on the trails. Kids grew up exploring those woods. Nobody bothered to verify who actually owned them because the answer never seemed important. Until suddenly it was. Around that time, I began researching zoning regulations and future land use options. What started as curiosity quickly became opportunity. The property carried a mixed-use agricultural designation with recreational development potential. The county encouraged responsible conservation projects. There were pathways for private outdoor recreation businesses. There were environmental grants, habitat restoration programs, tourism incentives. The more I learned, the more obvious the answer became. If everyone cared so much about the forest, maybe the forest should finally be managed properly. I contacted a conservation consultant named Eric Maddox. After walking the property together for several hours, he pointed out issues I had never noticed. Erosion along unofficial trails, wildlife disturbances, invasive plant growth near heavily used areas. Unregulated access had slowly damaged portions of the ecosystem. Ironically, the people claiming to protect the preserve were contributing to its decline. We spent weeks designing a management plan, designated hiking routes, controlled camping areas, habitat restoration zones, seasonal wildlife protections, liability coverage, emergency access routes, fire prevention measures, everything the HOA had ignored for years. Then came the decision that changed everything. I ordered a gate, a very large gate. The primary trail entrance sat near the subdivision boundary where most residents entered the woods. That's where the gate went. On installation day, several homeowners gathered nearby to watch. Some filmed with their phones. Others crossed their arms and stared as if witnessing a public execution. The steel posts went into the ground. The gate swung into place. Cameras were mounted. Signs followed. Private property. Authorized access only. Future recreational facility under development. The reaction was immediate. Neighborhood social media exploded. People accused me of greed. Others claimed I was destroying a community tradition. One resident dramatically announced that local families had lost their connection with nature. That same resident lived less than 10 minutes from 3 public parks and a state forest. Apparently, nature only counted when it was free and located on somebody else's land. A week later, the HOA requested a formal meeting. I agreed, partly because I wanted to remain professional, partly because I was curious how they planned to argue against property records. The meeting took place inside the subdivision clubhouse. The room was packed. Homeowners filled nearly every chair. The HOA president, a man named Douglas Mercer, opened with a prepared statement about community values and shared resources. Then he shifted toward legal arguments. He suggested the neighborhood had acquired implied rights through long-term use. He mentioned maintenance expenditures, volunteer cleanup efforts, historical access. The presentation sounded impressive until actual law entered the conversation. My attorney sat quietly until Douglas finished speaking. Then he opened a folder and began addressing each claim one by one. The room grew noticeably quieter. Long-term recreational use did not create ownership. Volunteer maintenance did not create ownership. Unauthorized trail construction did not create ownership. No adverse possession requirements had been satisfied. No easements existed. No agreements existed. No legal foundation existed. One homeowner interrupted and asked whether the community could sue. My attorney smiled politely and replied, "Anyone can file a lawsuit. Winning is a different matter." The room went silent. That sentence landed like a hammer. For the first time, people started realizing they had mistaken convenience for entitlement. The meeting ended without resolution. But something had changed. The confidence that fueled the HOA's resistance was beginning to crack. Meanwhile, my project continued moving forward. Permits were approved. Insurance policies were finalized. Parking areas were constructed outside the subdivision boundary. Trail improvements began. Restoration crews removed invasive species. Damaged sections of the forest were repaired. By early autumn, Grayson Ridge Outdoor Preserve officially opened. The launch exceeded every expectation. Hikers arrived from neighboring counties. Families reserved camping permits weeks in advance. Wildlife photography groups booked guided tours. Conservation organizations partnered with us on habitat projects. Revenue flowed directly back into maintaining the land. Better trails, better environmental protections, better safety standards. Everything operated transparently and professionally. Then came the most satisfying twist of the entire story. Many HOA residents purchased annual memberships. The same people who had spent months complaining about private ownership now willingly paid for access. Some even admitted the preserve looked better than it ever had before. The trails were safer. The environment was healthier. The experience was better organized. Even Douglas, the HOA president who had fought me the hardest, quietly bought a family pass. Nobody mentioned it publicly, but I noticed. Looking back, that moment says everything about the conflict. The board never truly cared about ownership. They cared about control. They assumed the forest would always exist as a free extension of their neighborhood because nobody had challenged that assumption. When reality finally arrived, it felt unfair to them, even though nothing had actually changed except enforcement of existing rights. The preserve thrived throughout the following year. Wildlife populations improved. Visitor numbers increased. Restoration projects expanded. The land my grandfather quietly protected for decades finally received the management it deserved. And every time I drove past the entrance gate, I couldn't help smiling a little. Not because I had defeated the HOA, not because I had won an argument, but because a piece of family history that everyone else overlooked had been transformed into something sustainable, protected, and undeniably respected. The people who once believed they owned the forest had accidentally helped reveal its true value. They just never expected the owner to show up. A year after everything settled down, I found myself standing on a ridge overlooking the property just before sunset. The same woods that had sparked months of arguments now looked healthier than they had in decades. The trails were maintained. The streams were cleaner. Wildlife sightings were increasing. Families were enjoying the land in a structured way that balanced recreation with conservation. And honestly, that's when I finally stopped thinking about the HOA battle itself. Because the longer I reflected on the whole experience, the more I realized the conflict had never really been about land. It was about assumptions. People become comfortable with routines. They get used to things working a certain way. Then, over time, they stop asking who created those opportunities or who carries the responsibility behind them. They simply accept the benefit as permanent. This is a psychological trap that affects neighborhoods, organizations, businesses, and even families. The longer a privilege exists, the easier it becomes to mistake it for a right. Looking back, I don't believe most residents were bad people. In fact, many were perfectly reasonable once emotions cooled down. They had spent years walking those trails, making memories there, introducing their children to those woods. When access changed, they felt like something had been taken from them. Human beings naturally react that way. The problem was that feelings and ownership were never the same thing. From a legal perspective, property rights exist precisely because emotions are unreliable. If ownership could be transferred simply because enough people enjoyed something long enough, no property owner would ever be secure. According to standard procedure, boundaries, deeds, surveys, and recorded rights exist to remove guesswork from situations exactly like this. The lesson here is that clarity prevents conflict. Had the developer, the HOA, or even previous residents verified ownership years earlier, none of this would have escalated. Instead, assumptions filled the vacuum left by missing facts. What still makes me laugh is the irony of the outcome. The board spent months fighting a preserve that eventually became better than the one they imagined they already had. The forest didn't disappear. It didn't become a shopping center. It didn't become a parking lot. It became safer, healthier, and more sustainable. The very thing they feared never happened. If anything, the land gained stronger protection than ever before. My grandfather used to say that responsibility is what turns ownership into stewardship. At the time, I thought it was just one of those old country sayings people repeat without thinking. Now I understand exactly what he meant. Owning something isn't about control. It's about taking responsibility for its future. That's ultimately what happened here. A forgotten piece of family land stopped being an overlooked backdrop and became an actively protected resource. So if you've ever dealt with an HOA dispute, a property disagreement, or even a situation where people assumed they were entitled to something they never actually owned, I'd love to hear your story. Do you think the HOA was completely wrong, or do you understand why residents reacted the way they did? At what point does community tradition stop and private ownership begin? Drop your thoughts in the comments because I guarantee this debate will divide people. Some viewers will say I should have left everything exactly as it was. Others will say I waited too long to enforce my rights. Personally, I think the truth sits somewhere in the middle. But one thing is certain, when I inherited 300 acres beside that subdivision, everyone expected the land to keep serving the neighborhood exactly as it always had. Nobody expected the actual owner to step forward, open the records, close the gate, and completely change the future of the forest.